But this was a packed part of the book. And so I want to make sure that we have plenty of time to discuss. Just welcome to everyone who is joining. I know we still have people logging on, but welcome to the first session of the first book of the 2022 Big Blue Book Club. And so we will be discussing The Less People Know About Us, A Mystery of Betrayal, Family Secrets, and Stolen Identity by Axton Betz-Hamilton. I will be your host for this series. I'm Dr. Nicole Huff, the Extension Specialist for Family Finance and Resource Management at the University of Kentucky with Family and Consumer Sciences Extension. And so I am so excited for you to join us today. All right, Mindy, the next slide. Okay, so why did we choose this book? And so this is a very different book. If you joined us, especially last year for the Financial Book Club, we talked about retirement planning. We were joined by Dr. Barb O'Neill. And so that had a very different feel. This book, however, it is an autobiographical account of Dr. Betz-Hamilton's experiences growing up and her experiences with stolen identity and family secrets. And so we'll get a chance to meet Dr. Betz-Hamilton on the last week. But for those of you who are not familiar with my background, I am by training a family therapist. And so a lot of my work that I do, I look at the intersection between mental health and financial health. And when I read this book and when I met Dr. Betz-Hamilton, I knew this was one I wanted to incorporate into the Big Blue Book Club. Because as you can tell, if you've already started reading with us, that it is a rich book with a lot of things to unpack related to family and finances and dynamics. And so it's a very raw account of her traumatic experiences. So there was a little dicey language. And so I do want to caution you, you've likely come in contact with it, but it's because it was written from a very raw place. And I think that, experiencing family life is not messy and clean, and it's definitely not always PG. And so we're gonna really unpack that. All right, so Mindy, you can go on to the next slide, please. Now, before we dive into mentee, so we're going to come back to that. If you are not already a part of the Big Blue Book Club on Facebook, go ahead and snap this QR code and join us on Facebook. And so we, as a larger group, we will be continuing the discussion through the online chat of Facebook over the next 3 weeks. And so it's a great way to continue to talk about the book in between sessions. And so we would love for you to join us there as well. All right, next slide, please. All right, so today, the book is divided into 3 sections, and we will just be talking about section 1 today. So if you have read ahead, no spoilers, please. No spoilers, please. And I do want to say, if you have a Q&A, if you have a question for me or Mindy or for the author, or just a question at any point, if you would use the Q&A feature, sometimes it can get lost in the chat. And so if you do have questions at any point, if it's for today's session or just something that you wanted to ask for a future session or something you want to ask the author, we'll be banking all of those Q&As. And so if you could use that instead of the chat, that way we don't lose any important comments. But today we'll just be talking about part 1. And so that is right up until the time that Axton leaves for college at Purdue. So we will be talking about her from about the time she's 11 until she's 17 or so. And so all that transpires within those 6 years of her childhood. And so the first session today, we're going to be talking about family dysfunction. And we saw a lot of that in this first part of the book. And we'll be talking about finances and fraud, but mostly those family dynamics that kind of undergird part one of the book. Then next week, we're going to move in from family dysfunction into financial despair. And we'll be talking about identity theft and credit, consumer protection, and we'll dive into the nitty-gritty of that identity theft and those experiences that Axton had to face to overcome that. And then in week 3, we will be joined by Axton Betz-Hamilton live, who will be here for to share her thoughts and to share what has happened since the book was published. And it'll give you a chance for a live Q&A and some real-time discussion with that author as we then get to the spoilers and those final discoveries, and we talk about her experience. Okay, so on to the next slide, Mindy. Okay, so if you logged on right at the beginning of the webinar, then you saw this screen. And so we will be using the online platform Mentee. And so you can take your phone, just like I'm about to do now on the screen. And if you just angle your camera at that QR code, you can go right to the slides for this. And so some of the slides have interactive polling. And you can also type in mentee.com and enter the code 45749762. And so we hope that once you are on Mentee and the polls start coming in, that it will give you an ability to just engage with us, because it's hard to have a discussion with such a large group, but we want to make sure that we are able to discuss this. And so we're going to be using Mentee as a virtual way to discuss. Okay. So now we're going to go on. So our first poll, and this should be showing up on your personal device, your phone, your tablet. If you would use your cursor or your finger and kind of click, where are you from? So we want to see, where is everyone joining us today? So kind of let us know, where are you from? And we're going to see kind of who we have represented across the state. Or outside of the state, it looks like. Some of you are typing it in the chat as well, and that is a way to participate. It won't pop right up on the screen, but absolutely, if you don't have access to Mentee, feel free to use the chat. We're seeing many counties across our state represented. All right, that's great. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so now also using Mentee, I'd like for you to enter a word. You can enter more than one, but one word at a time. And so we're going to build a word cloud. So in very short descriptions, how would you describe part 1? So what descriptive words would you use to describe part 1? So as these word clouds build, the bigger the word, the more responses that word received. So type in your thoughts. So one word descriptions of part 1. And then if you're typing it in the chat, Mindy will help to put those into the word cloud. And I will too. I'm trying to participate as well. All right, so I'm seeing, all right, so our responses are slowing. Let's see. We are seeing some big words. The big words we're seeing are interesting, dysfunctional, emotional, sad, scary, mysterious, disturbing, overwhelming, broken, confusing, stressful, sad, disturbing, complex, disheartening, paranoia, relatable, deep, informative, heartbreaking. And so we can see how in just these first 15 chapters, we are running a gamut of emotion. And that is including some very disturbing emotions as well. And so neglect is something frightening, wrenching, fascinating, frustrating. It is very frustrating, intense. Okay, so let's go to the next poll, Mindy. All right, so of those emotions, and so you can follow along, just click the next question on mentee. Now, could you relate to Axton's childhood? Not really, parts of it, or very much so. So let us know, how were you able to relate to the storyline? And there is no right or wrong answer. And so it's a complex story and with lots of moving parts. And again, we're seeing in the text chat, some not really, some very much. Yeah, so again, we're seeing this, we're seeing a spread with most of the responses saying, no, not really. This was outside of the realm of what I experienced. But then we're seeing others who said, I could relate to parts of that. Okay, and so we'll go on, let's go on to the next one. And so this is another word cloud we're building. So what really stood out to you in, this is an open-ended response. So just, you can type in, what were some of those parts of the story that were most compelling or that you most resonated with or were most disturbed by? And so take a moment and type in those responses, and then we'll see those build on the screen. Okay, so I'm seeing, and I'll start to read these off, but keep typing your responses. So caring for the adults, the darkness, the disturbing, I'm seeing disturbed come up a lot, the lack of communication, the isolation, how Axton was treated, how much she endured in her family, in her childhood, that there were hiding of problems, very little discussion, very little communication, a lot of justification, identity crisis, caring for the elderly, family drama, loneliness, despair, the mother's shopping habits. Oh yes, that Axton was alone and bullied and fearful. The maturity of such a young child, her awareness of her situation, confusion, a lack of responsibility, the father's lack of knowledge of their financial situation. Yeah, we'll dive into all of this. Her mother was intelligent, but very disconnected. A lack of parenting skills, little regard for Axton's feelings, very poor family dynamics, how trapped Axton felt, abuse, hysteria, Making Axton feel responsible for protecting her family from dangers as a young child. Yes, we're going to talk about that as well. No friendship. Yeah. And so again, so it's no wonder that we run that gamut of emotions with that first word cloud of how sad and disturbing and just heartbreaking this story is, because it is riddled. Again, this is just from ages 11 to 17, and it is riddled, those 6 years, with many, many layers of family dysfunction. All right, and so let's move from these stories, and you may repeat some of your answers, but let's go to this level of dysfunction. Use of diet drugs. I'm seeing all this. You're going to have a chance to repeat some of those. So let's really just kind of hone in. And so now we are going to build a word cloud. What were some of those patterns or examples of family dysfunction that we witnessed in chapters 1 through 15 in part 1? So talk, oh yeah, that's a good one. And we're about to talk about that. So let's type these in now. And again, you can just move on to next question in Mentee. I'm seeing them coming at the chat as well, and we'll get those into the box, into the word cloud. Yeah. Keep typing them in as you are able, because we saw a lot. So some of the ones I'm seeing pop up, big ones: isolation, secrets, neglect, lack of communication, depression, fear, anger, paranoia, poor communication, shopping extremes, emotional spending, distrust, ignoring, paranoia, making excuses, unhappy, sadness, anger, confusion, denial, control, blame, mental illness, eating, anxiety, secrecy, depression, parentification, which is something we will talk about in an upcoming slide. Neglect. All right, so the layers: gambling, I believe I saw up there, and I know I saw addiction. Those were some ones that I noticed. And we see poverty and limited resources. Panic disorder, mental illness, abuse, poverty. All right, so let's go on to the next slide, Mindy. And so with some of these patterns of dysfunction, of very unhealthy functioning, we notice a lot of generational dynamics at play. And this is a quote that stood out to me. And I know it stood out to some others that I've had some conversation with or have sent me just comments on the book. But this was something that that Axton recounted that her mom said. You know, they were out with her dad and she was looking over the fields, and she said, you know, we were looking at the outbuildings and fields, and he told me, this will all be yours someday, Pam, but nobody even asked me if I wanted it. And so we see it with the mom, Pam, and then we see it repeated with Axton, that there is a lot of this feeling of being entrapped by your town, entrapped by your family, by your financial situation, by the dynamics that are at play. And so some of the dynamics brought up, for me, some of these themes. So we see, Farm succession. So this quote goes back to farm succession and estate planning, right? And having a plan. And are you communicating about that? And so Pam didn't want the farm. She didn't want to move back and take care of her aging parents or to fill in the gaps when a parent had passed away. But that burden was placed on her shoulders and then inadvertently placed on John's and placed on Axton's as well. And so we see, talking about the estate and how inside it was like a museum and the house had not been changed in decades. And which we also see sometimes with estate planning and what happens if there is not a clear plan in place and one heir inherits everything and then must keep or dispose of all of the belongings. And so these are just some food for thought. We saw the theme of caring for aging parents and death and end of life care and that sandwich generation of needing to come in and care for parents, care for a business, care for property, but also a child that that was minimized on that responsibility list. We saw a lot of family secrets and rehearsing a script. Right. And so that they had a script that they rehearsed. So on the outside and even to the point where their property looked pristine. So if anybody looking in would say that they were a family that had it all together. But then as soon as you open those doors, we know that it was a very different experience. And you couldn't look in because the windows were closed. But we also see some generational patterns repeated on both John and Pam's side. And then Axton bore the brunt of a lot of this. So alcoholism, we see different kinds of addiction, shopping addiction, the addiction of appearances. And we see that with Pam's mom and with Pam as well. With abuse, physical abuse in John's family, we see verbal abuse to emotional abuse. Abandonment, we see that on both sides of the family, gambling, different kinds of addiction. And so there are many others, many others. All right, so let's get to the next slide. And here's another poll for you. What are some specific examples of stress that Axton experienced? So this is just the things that Axton had to endure. Yes, bullying, fear. What were some of the weights on Axton's shoulders? Again, if you're putting them in the chat, we'll work to get them in the word cloud. Yeah, this is a lot for a little girl, ages 11 to 17. Some of the big words: anxiety, bullying, food insecurity, money, isolation, secrecy, hunger, family dynamics, confusion, silence, isolation, too much responsibility, the word parentification, which we'll talk about on the next slide, appearances, families fighting, anxiety, protecting the property, no friends, suppression, fear of strangers, paranoia, appearance, seeing a lot of paranoia, depression, covering up, so forcing to keep up those secrets. Yeah, overworked. Maturity, and maturity can be a burden, right? We're only supposed to be so mature from 11 to 17. We're not supposed to bear the burdens of the adults in our lives, but often we do. So let's move on to that next slide and let's talk about that. Let's talk about how Axton was parentified. And so this is a word, that I know some of you are familiar with it because I've seen it come up on the word clouds. And so this idea of parentification. And so by definition, it's the distortion or the lack of boundaries between family members, such that the child or the children take on roles and responsibilities usually reserved for adults. And so we saw Axton being parentified, and many of those weights that you all just put in that word cloud were examples of this. So from chapter 1, where she popped open Grandpa's beer and she took him his medication, and she was there with him on his deathbed, and then was left to grieve him alone at 11, going in with her dead grandfather on the bed, and she was, and I saw this come up in the word cloud as well, where she was charged with protecting the property, and to the point where she was paranoid and chased off a utility worker with a knife at 12, 13 years old. And so we see that this led to, and Mindy, we can go to the next slide. This led to mental health challenges. And so some of the dysfunction that we saw, whether it was whichever generation, whether it was in Axton, with Axton's parents, or with her grandparents, we see a lot of mental health challenges present. And so what part 1 does is it sets up what's to come in the book, and how these challenges that ran through generations were at the crux of a lot of the betrayal, family secrets, and ultimately the stolen identity. But panic attacks. So we see at a very young age, when Axton is in middle school, attending a school church camp, that she has her first panic attack. And at the time, she says, maybe it was the flu, but it took me out for a couple of days. And we know later then in high school that was diagnosed as a panic disorder, but one that the mom never disclosed to the therapist all of the things that may have contributed to that panic disorder. So we see anxiety and depression. We know that we see eating disorders prevalent, and body image issues prevalent with both the mom and then Axton, to the point where she ties a rope around her waist, a piece of twine from the barn around her waist, to not get any bigger, and to loosen that. We see food being used as a control, and because she had food insecurity issues, then she could at least begin to decide not to eat. So it wasn't that she didn't have enough to eat, which she didn't, but she then kind of took control of that situation and said, well, I'm not going to eat anyway. Where she hedged to forage through her family's farm and take apples to school. And we see her continuing on with dieting and unhealthy practices for weight loss as an older teen. We see paranoia and mistrust. We see rage, disassociation. Pam is a good example of that in the beginning of the book, where she just watched TV and disassociated, and where John disassociated from the family by going outside. We see Axton experience isolation, and that's a danger in families. When no one can look in on a family, then that is when family members are at highest risk for abuse, and that's why things like school system and community and church and neighbors and extended family are so important with accountability within family systems, because that is how somebody can see what's going on to intervene. And so we see a lot of mental health challenges present. And so let's go to the next poll, Mindy. So now, just thinking about Axton, not her parents, not her grandparents, how did Axton cope with the stress? So what were some coping mechanisms that she used? So let's type those in. Yes. So what are some ways that Axton coped with her stress? And we're seeing things come in. Controlling her diet, 4-H, cats, Yeah, so animals, studying, reading, not eating, pretending, lashing out, denial, hiding, studying. Yeah, these are great. So academic, she threw herself into her school. Animals. Yeah, making goals. That's a great one. Making goals to escape her current situation. And she'll tell us on week 3, this is what fueled her career as, so she is a professor at South Dakota State University. And so she continues to be an expert in identity theft. And a lot of that was fueled from those goals she set at an early age. All right, and so if we look at this, so one of the top that pop out are reading, and that's great, and 4-H. And so that is one thing that is so good to see come out. And so that was where she found her most connection to people and to animals. It gave her a sense of purpose and comfort and stability in her life. And so did school. And so we can see a mix here that there are both healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms that she employed to kind of burden those stress through those years. Okay, so let's get to the next slide. Okay, so now let's just think of, this can be things that John did, that Pam did, or that you do, or you know of someone. What are unhealthy coping mechanisms that people of all ages use to lessen the burden of a situation? So what are some unhealthy coping mechanisms that people employ? And this can be from the book or just from life, from your experience with life. And a few that are coming in and that I had. Yep. Some of the big ones. So shopping and retail therapy, which we, yeah, absolutely. And so spending beyond our means and spending to provide us a sense of control or gratification can be an unhealthy coping mechanism. Denial, avoidance, isolation, drugs, alcohol, addiction, eating, fake appearances, withdrawing, ignoring, denial, hypervigilance. These are great. Overachieving. Yeah, that can be, that's a unique one, but we can be compelled sometimes to overcome our situation by pushing ourselves. Yeah. Escapism, working too much, TV, a lot of television. Yeah, that's a form of escapism. Being alone, denial, spending money, avoidance, ignoring. Yeah. And so some of these were both prevalent in the book, and we know are prevalent in life. Anger, I'm seeing. Yeah. Depression, which is often a byproduct, right, of an unhealthy situation and something we may not be able to control, but we know that it's the way our body copes sometimes. And so sometimes coping mechanisms are active behaviors that we participate in, and sometimes they're not. They're our body protecting us. And sometimes our body will shut down. And that might be emotionally as we experience anxiety or depression. It could be through insomnia, other things. Yeah, these are good. All right, but let's pivot from this just a little bit. Let's get to the next poll. And let's change from unhealthy coping mechanisms to healthy coping mechanisms. And these can be things you witness in the book or, again, just in your life. How do you cope in healthy ways? Because life is hard. The past 2 years have been hard, and different life stages are hard. So what are some healthy ways that you cope? Oh, seeing some really good ones pop in and typing in some that I'm seeing come in on the text chat. Exercise, reading, yoga, therapy, and that is such a healthy way. And I'm thankful, and that's a big word, which means that more than one person entered that. So turning to our support systems, like our therapists, like friends, family, music, crafts, sleep, yes. And so resting and prioritizing our health, getting out in nature, deep breathing. We know, like from Axton, being involved in things like 4-H, like KEHA, like this book club, but being involved. Counting my blessings, yes, practicing gratitude is backed by research as a way to help us focus on what is going good in our situation, even if that's just the breath in our lungs. Yeah. Taking a break, meditating, pets, yes, laughter, having time for fun. So schoolwork can be a healthy coping mechanism, right? Focusing on investing in yourself. And we'll talk about what social capital is. Confiding in a friend. Yeah. And so I think it's sometimes important for us to remind ourselves of different ways to cope and what may be unhealthy, but what are some healthy alternatives? And sometimes it is just getting out for a walk, turning to a friend, setting boundaries. And that's hard. That's hard to do. Music's a big one. Self-care. And so these are really great. Vacation, faith. I'm seeing that in there. Absolutely. Finding your joy. And so identifying what it is that brings you. Cleaning, volunteering, walks, having fun. Yes, we can send. I did see that question come in. This will be recorded and made available. Absolutely. And then what we will do, and I didn't mention this, but what I'll do in between sessions is to summarize these, send out notes pages with some tips of the responses. Yeah, absolutely. Helping others. These are great. And there's, again, a lot of research to support that when we help others and invest in others, then that can make us feel better about our situation, because it takes the focus off of ourselves and puts it on to someone else. And then we'll usually experience the momentum of that. All right, so this is fantastic responses. Okay, so let's get to the next one, Mindy. All right, so this one, again, this one's one you can use your finger or your cursor if you can. But for each of the relationship in, okay, so I'll note, someone said that the dark blue background is hard to see. So we'll make sure to change that next time. But these are some of the key relationships in Axton's life. So dad, mom, Grandpa Elliot, who is Pam's dad, Grandpa Betz, who is John's dad. So Grandpa Elliot is who they moved in first with the satellite dish, and then Grandpa Betz moved into the mobile home later. And then Harriet and Gordon are the boss at Burger King, and her husband, who took Pam on Pizza Hut dates for her birthday. So use your finger or your cursor and kind of, where do you see them providing support? So these are just a few of the key relationships that were mentioned in part 1. And so where is Axton drawing support from these relationships? And I do think it's interesting that we're not getting very far on the supportive, because the one end of the poll is not supportive, the other is supportive. And we're seeing that at best, she just has middle of the road support. And we're seeing that come in a lot from dad. And so she seems to have a good relationship with dad. And we do see that improve and continue throughout the book. So if you've not read parts 2 and 3, you'll see that continue. We are seeing not a lot of support from mom. And so we're seeing support from Grandpa Elliot, and that was Pam's dad. And that seems to be his personality, as he was supportive in marrying Grandma Elliot. And after she had a history of failed marriages and abandonment of her kids. And we see Grandpa Elliot coming in there. And then, although we have some different dynamics, we do see him taking Pam out for snacks and hamburgers and French fries, and treating her and splurging on her son. We don't see a lot of support from Grandpa Betz. That's John's dad. We see absenteeism from him not following the family's dynamics and their internal rules. I mean, we do see some support come from Harriet and Gordon, and like I mentioned, birthday parties and whatnot. Yeah. All right, so let's get to the next slide. Oh, yes. And so I'm seeing in the comment that it's so sad there were so few people to offer support because of the isolation. Yeah. And that's why some of those other coping mechanisms that we mentioned were so important for her, because she didn't have people. And so that's something that I did want to point out, that there are many sources of capital. And so when we think in terms of family finance and resource management, we talk about capital and what that can look like. And it can take on different forms. And I often talk about social capital, human capital, financial capital. But we know that support can come in many ways. And of course, there's the finances, right? We need resources to give us food on our table and clothes and a home, and to make sure that the lights are not turned off, and that we have gas and to heat our homes and to fuel our cars. So finances are important, or other sources of income and resources. But many things that we see here, we have physical support and physical capital. And so again, food in our bellies, making sure that we are healthy. Our health is a form of capital. Making sure that we are safe, and that physically safe, emotionally safe. And these don't all fit into nice, neat categories. There is the psychological capital and emotional, social. So our networks are a form of capital. And when we talk about resiliency and what allows people to overcome some of their challenges, the variety of support and capital that they have in their lives is very predictive of, are they able to rebound? And so I saw this came up in the word cloud, spiritual capital and our faith. For those of you who that is a source of support. Again, we are not meant to be in isolation. And so your social networks, whether that's your family or your friends, your neighbors, a church group, a community group, your extension networks, there's a variety of sources of capital and support. And they bounce off of one another. Absolutely. And so they interplay and they work together to help you overcome things like an abusive past or an unsure future. And so it can help us overcome both past, present, and future obstacles. And so investing in any one of these is helpful for others, but for ourselves as well. All right, so let's go to the next slide, Mindy. All right, so we're going to kind of shift here in the last few minutes of our time together and talk about how the finances were strained and some of the things that we saw as a result, financially, as a result of those family dynamics. And we have mentioned this, we saw food insecurity. They didn't have a home phone. Their home phone was shut off and they had a prepaid cell phone. We saw that at times their lights flickered on and off. The gas was shut off. There was always the threat of losing something that was vital, living in dark for a few days because of those utilities. We see John draining his 401k because of the threat of foreclosure to the farm and to the house. We see that one person controlled all of the money, and we'll talk in the next slide, and as well as next week about some of these red flags. And that is a danger when in a family, when there is one person who's in control of the finances, or that just manages the finances. And so maybe it's a very lighthearted situation, but all parties aren't involved in the decision making. So you can't see if there are problems with debt or credit or mismanagement of money. We see that there is some impulse buying, that there is a shopping addiction, secrecy. When we keep secrets with our money, when we are not transparent about our purchases, that can be a red flag. And then this idea to keep up with the Joneses, or this idea of keeping up appearances. All right, so let's go on to the next. So just out of curiosity, and this is a word cloud, so who controlled or managed the finances in your childhood home? So maybe it was both parents, maybe it was one or the other. So who controlled or managed your family's finances? All right, so a lot of both. I'm seeing them both, and mom, dad, but mostly both. That's great. That's great. Both parents, mom, dad, or division. So maybe mom for some things and dad for others. So division, both parents. And again, we'll talk about that. So in session 2, we're going to kind of unpack what's going on financially here with credit, with identity theft, with financial control and transparency and whatnot. And so planting that seed, again, that there is no, I'll say there's no right or wrong, but there is a best practice. And the best practice is open communication about your resources. And because we didn't see that in Axton's family, that is a root of some of the problems that's going on there. All right, so let's go to the next one. All right, so some of these, again, this is kind of recap, but some of those financial red flags, and I hope that some of these started jumping out to you as you read. Secret spending behavior, missing mail, right? And so mail wasn't coming in, and opening new PO boxes in different counties. The arrest warrant coming in for check fraud. And so I think the quote was, they were pretending to be mom in open daylight, non-payment for utilities, the foreclosure, just this paranoia. And then we hear Axton say and repeat what became her mom and even her dad's mantra, but it was really her mom's family mantra: the less people know about us, the better. And so this was, we don't talk about what's going on. We rehearse our scripts. We don't let anyone into our house. We don't go anywhere. We protect our property. And so these are some of the flags that we'll really see expanded in the next part. All right, so let's go to the next poll, Mindy. All right, so as we begin to transition into next week, I am curious, have you been the victim of identity theft or fraud? So the choices are no, not that I'm aware. No, but I know someone who has been, and yes, unfortunately. It's important that we put that, not that I'm aware, because that's the thing, is we're not always aware when fraud or identity theft has happened. Yeah, and so identity theft, and we will, so I saw someone say, can you define that? And we will absolutely define it, especially next week. We'll look at different types of fraud and what are some different, it may just be a scam. You may have fallen victim to a scam. You may have, if you follow along our MoneyWise initiative, and I hope that you have been, you'll see that in March, I talk about insurance, unemployment insurance fraud, and that my family has recently been the victim of that with the taxes and the crazy things. So it can range from something very little to something very big, like someone stealing your Social Security number. And we will really define that all next week. All right, so we are seeing most people, at least who are responding, are saying, not that they're aware, but we see some that know of someone, and then some say yes. Oh, that's a good question. I'll let you know here. I think on one of the last slides, I'll let you know how to connect with MoneyWise. We'll also put that in the text chat, and I'll put it in the email. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, because this is an open-ended response. If you are one of the ones who said, yes, I have experienced fraud, what kind? And if you said, no, but I know someone who has, tell us what kind of fraud or scam that you have experienced. And again, this is just a jumping off point for next week's larger conversation. Stolen credit card number, Social Security number stolen, credit card. I'll type mine in there. Like I said, we were unemployment insurance, tax fraud. Okay, magazine subscription scam, credit card charged. Yeah, and so having fraudulent credit card charges, unemployment insurance, government personnel records were accessed. Yeah, so maybe you were a part of it on behalf of a company who had a security breach. Even if your email was hacked, right? That's a mild form of identity theft. Someone is pretending to be you. Tax fraud, a victim of that, bank card, debit card, credit card, check fraud, forged checks taken from mailbox. Oh no, an extension event was scammed for registration. All right, so your daughter's identity was stolen. Somebody had claimed her as an dependent. So again, that tax fraud, that is also a deeper form of identity theft. Facebook account hacked, credit card hacked, several $100s worth of purchases, email hack. And so we'll continue. And as you read into part 2 for next week, think about these, the experiences in your own life. Again, it may be small, but even if someone has access to your email, they have access to your contact list, right? And so fraud and identity theft can be along a continuum that can be it can be annoying in your life, but it can also be devastating in your life. And it can kind of range along a continuum that we will talk about more next week. All right, so I have just a couple more here, and then we are wrapping up. So hang with me if you can to the next slide. I am curious as to when is the last time, okay, so again, next week, we're gonna be talking about these 3 things. All right, so go ahead to the next poll, Mindy, because we have just a couple of slides in the last few minutes. All right, so quick poll. Do you know your credit score? No clue, I have an idea, or yes? I kind of want to get a gauge of where we're at before we start next week's discussion. I'm seeing a lot. Yes, this is good that you do know or have an idea of when it should be. All right, so let's go on to the next one. We have just a minute or 2 left together. All right, when was the last time you checked your credit report? Never, within the last year, the last month, or it's been several years. And again, we'll expand all of this next time, but I just kind of want to get a pulse at where we're at. As we're talking about theft and identity and credit history, where are we at? All right. And seeing within a lot of the last month, the last year, or several years, no one's saying they've never checked it. So that is good. But if you haven't, it's okay. You can start today, and we'll talk about how to go about checking your credit, the importance of that next week. All right, great. Okay, so as we wrap up here, you can type your final thoughts here. You can type them in the Q&A or the chat box. We'll collect all of those. And also you can put them on the evaluation, on the session 1 evaluation. And so, yeah, so, all right. So compelling, it is, glad to hear. Yeah, it's confusing, but that you enjoy this format. And so, all right. And so if you think of questions for next week, you couldn't put the book down. Yeah, scary. It is an eye opener. It is an eye opener for sure. You guys can continue to type your comments. Again, I'll pull all of these. You can put them in the Q&A. You can put them in the chat. But Mindy, as we're at the top of the hour, if you would advance to the next slide, because I would love for you to take the evaluation. Now, I will put the link in the email, but if you have your phone or smart device, go ahead and snap that QR code and give us feedback on session 1. On did you like using mentee? What stood out to you about session 1, and if you have any questions for us to consider next week. But we're at the top of our hour again. Yeah, and if Mindy has that URL link, she can put it in. If she doesn't have it, I will be sure it will go out in the follow-up email that is sent out. So we will make sure that you get a URL too. Yeah, Mindy, do you have that URL that you can pop in there? If
for the evaluation,
yep.
I do. Hold on just one second.
Okay, so we're getting that URL, but while she's doing that, you can continue to type, but we'll make sure to get that in your inbox as well. And if you have your smartphone, you can snap it. I'm so glad to hear that you guys are loving this, and then the book only gets deeper. So session 2 will take us even deeper into Axton's accents. And yeah, and if you had trouble with mentee and some of you are commenting, put that in the evaluation for sure, because we're trying to explore different ways that we can engage with one another besides breakout rooms, especially with large audiences. And so all within an hour. But we will continue the conversation on Facebook between sessions 1 and 2, and then we will meet back here next week. And so
I'm having trouble getting it in.
It's okay. And we'll follow up in your email and in the Facebook group. We'll follow up with the URL for that. And so no worries at all if you don't have that. And we will get that to you next week. So thanks so much for joining us. Again, if you couldn't complete the evaluation, look for that link in your Facebook group or in the email. But we are so excited to have you join us. And yes, don't forget to come back for week 3 as well, because Axton will join. So someone put in the chat that they were excited to have the author join us. And yeah, if you are just starting to read, I'm seeing that come in. That is okay. You can pick up at any time. The book reads really fast. And so join us where you are, regardless of where you've read. So thank you so much to everyone. And again, we will connect with that link just as soon as we can get it to you. So thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.